An oral history with Pam Solo, and this is for the Carnegie Library Oral History Project and the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum. Thank you very much, Pam, for doing this.
Yes, thank you.
And we're talking here in the Institute of Civil Society. Pam is the executive director of that. So, and we're going to be talking about Rocky Flats. So, Pam, the first question we like to ask is, when and where were you born?
I was born in Englewood, Colorado in 1946.
And can you describe a little bit about your family and what kind of early life you had?
Well, my parents were both born also in Colorado, so it makes me a second or third, and my grandmother's on my mother's side, so a third generation Colorado native. And my father grew up in southern Colorado in a coal mining camp called Starkville near Pueblo, and the Ludlow massacre had happened. You know, a lot of history. It's very working class background on his side, and as well as on my mother's side. And but they worked very hard to send us to good schools, believing that the way to progress in your life was a good education. So I went to St. Mary's Academy with their goal for us would be to be able to go to college, which they weren't able to do. And I have four siblings, 3 sisters, 1 brother, and you know, lived most of my life up till I guess 1983, 84 in Denver.
So you went to college where?
I went to college at Loretto Heights College, which is no longer Loretto Heights College, I guess. It's Japanese University or something like that.
So the schooling that you had was Catholic, or?
Yeah, it was a Catholic school.
Yeah,
Catholic education. I went to the same school from from first grade through high school.
I see. St. Mary's.
St. Mary's Academy, all girls school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then in college, did you major in anything special? Or?
Well, after high school, I joined the Sisters of Loretto, and in college, my interest really was theology and philosophy, and that's what I got my undergraduate degree in. Mm-hmm. And then went on to get a master's degree in sociology, the sociology of conflict, specifically, through Goddard College in Vermont. Though I did it as an external degree program, so I never was on the campus of Goddard College. Yeah, Elise Bolding from Boulder was my mentor, advisor, and so I put together an independent degree program. And
then did you, how long did you stay with the Sisters of Loretto?
Well, I was with the Sisters of Loretto, and in fact I'm still a co-member, but I left the vowed membership part and about 1988, 89. So I was there, I was a member, full vowed member for 25 years.
I see.
Yeah.
But you did many things in that time.
Yes, when I first graduated from college, I taught at St. Mary's Academy, where I had been a student, and I did that for a couple years, and then went on to work with the University Without Walls program at Loretto Heights College, taking about 5 or 6 high school juniors into the University Without Walls as early admissions freshmen, sort of as an experiment. But it was during that time, and I'd been very involved outside my teaching responsibilities and even in college with the United Farm Workers movement and different anti-Vietnam War activities. And it was around 1970, 71 that I wanted to get involved in much more full-time work against the Vietnam War and in the peace movement. So I went to work with the American Friends Service Committee, sharing a job with Judy Danielson. So the two of us did a job sharing thing.
Uh-huh.
And
was that was the American Friends Service Committee involved at that time in the anti-Vietnam War activities?
Yeah, AFSC was very involved in the Vietnam organizing, and that's a large part of what I did, was different kinds of activities that AFSC had organized. We organized, medical supplies and farming equipment to be sent to Vietnam, and different campaigns, but a lot of education and organizing kinds of work on Vietnam. And then as the Vietnam War was winding down, that's when we started examining the fact that we had sort of developed a permanent war economy, permanent war posture, and that, what Eisenhower had warned of, the military-industrial complex was pretty much had become a permanent feature of life in Colorado. And about that same time, there was also plans to use nuclear weapons to stimulate natural gas, and they had planned 40,000 nuclear explosions in the mountains to stimulate natural gas. So this was sort of the peaceful use, quote, peaceful use of the bomb. And some of us were organizing against that, and also looking at other very harmful sites where the military activity in Colorado was endangering, not only playing a major role in sort of the threat posture of the United States, but playing a role in undermining the health and safety of citizens in the greater metropolitan area. So we focused on the Rocky Mountain Arsenal and the nerve gas that was being stored there. And I can't remember if there was much manufacturing going on at that point, but it was being stored there. And then started investigating Rocky Flats.
And can you remember what was your first experience in understanding what was going on at Rocky Flats? Had you known in this process, were you learning about what was going on at Rocky Flats?
We were learning about it, and the first knowledge that I had was information brought to us by Jock Cobb, who is a professor of preventive medicine and doctor in the Denver area. And he said, we really ought to start looking into that. So our process was to start just really asking around, asking, the health department and the fire department, and trying to get information, from those people who were supposed to watch out for our public health and safety. What was going on? What did they do there? What was the history? And there had been some big news reports about a very large fire that had taken place. And so that we were kind of working from that one incident that at that point had been the largest industrial fire in U.S. history, trying to find out were people watching out for us.
That's why you went to the fire department then, to kind of connect with the Rocky Flats fire in 1969.
Right. We went to the fire department, as I said, the fire department, the health, the state health department, the Jefferson County Health Department, anybody who would have any sort of official capacity. And then when Tim Wirth and Dick Lamm were both elected to office, went to them and asked them that we wanted to look more into this. And we'd made early contact with the Kelly brothers, who were union representatives. And they were concerned about worker health and safety. And actually, we bumped into them going in to meet with Tim Wirth as they were coming out. So it was like, well, that's sort of ironic.
And you had already made contact with them.
Yes, to find out, what their concerns were. And that was a commitment from the very beginning of ours, that not just to express opposition to the mission of Rocky Flats, but to really look at the effects that it was having on the community, the workforce. And so very early on we had this kind of politics about the whole thing. It was local hazard, global threat. But that was much more than, a catchy slogan for the campaign. It was our orientation to the problem. And we began looking into the history of the management, what corporations, I think it was Dow Chemical had managed it. They were losing their contract. So as soon as the went up for bid, we started meeting with the people who were taking over for Rockwell International. The guy's name was Bob Williams, and so we started having conversations with him about our concerns, what we wanted. And at that point, Tim Wirth and the governor then combined forces to set in motion the Rocky Flats Task Force, which was to hold public hearings and find out, to find answers to all the questions that we were posing and the machinists union was posing.
This was what came to be called the Lamm-Wirth Task Force?
Yes, the Lamm-Wirth Task Force.
And were you a part of that, or were there...
Jock Cobb was on that. He was an official member of that. And they held hearings, and we made sure that people were present at these hearings, that they knew that the hearings were going on. At this point, I think it was around then that we were also trying to find ways to further raise awareness about the fact that Rocky Flats was there, what its mission was, what plutonium was, the history of accidents, the history of bad management, to bring out into the public all of the facts that the Lamm-Wirth Task Force was uncovering. The fact that it had been so poorly managed under Dow Chemical that they hadn't changed the filters in the smokestacks for 20 years, I think. And some of those details I wouldn't pull off the top of my head this far back. But
is it your impression that Dick Lamm and Tim Wirth both had some political pressure on them to start this task force, or how did that really come about?
I think that yes, they both had political pressure, and I think they were, open to the idea that this really was a serious issue that had to be looked at. Just before this, remember we had there had been two campaigns. One is ballot initiatives. One to stop the Olympics from coming to Colorado, and then the other one to stop this blasting, the nuclear bombs being used, as I said, to stimulate natural gas. The public had stopped both of these things on environmental grounds, and the political context was that Lamm and Wirth, both came into office at a time when the public was very engaged and involved and concerned about protecting the environment and preserving as much of the public health and safety as possible. So they had a climate in which they could take leadership. So I think both things were true. They were open to it, but we had also worked very hard to create a climate where they could be responsive and had to be responsive. And I think that a major thing is that when the union goes there and says things are bad, then you can't ignore it. So I think without the union expressing their concern, it might not have taken off quite the way it did.
And when the task force presented its report, as I recall, there was some kind of recommendation for ongoing monitoring.
Well, there were recommendations for a lot of different things. One of them was, intense monitoring, greater collaboration between the officials at the plant and the state health department. But it had an ultimate recommendation that the plant be phased out. And so the thing that had real political teeth to it kind of just hung there and without any action on the part of either Lamm or Wirth. And at that point what they did was establish the Rocky Flats Monitoring Committee as sort of a permanent watchdog. And that's the thing that I was appointed to. And
who else worked with you on that?
Everybody was appointed by the governor to be members of that. And we had regular meetings out at Rocky Flats early in the morning, and different people on the monitoring committee chose to get high security clearance and that sort of thing.
Can you remember?
I chose not to.
I see. Can you remember what it was like to meet up there? And
It was
You got on site, right?
Oh yeah, we got on site when we arrived. I was the only woman on this committee. I think that's true, that I was the only woman, and we got there for our meetings, and just going through there, knowing what they do, and that the language, the euphemisms used for things like an explosion, an accident involving two plutonium cores, colliding together was called a nuclear excursion. So, you'd want to go for a sail or something like that. It was, to say bizarre is almost trite, because you were entering the world that you had, I was entering the world that I had feared and hated since I was a very little child, and they had us diving under desks, and this sense that all these nuclear weapons, the critical component for nuclear bombs, were made in our backyard, and here you are sitting around a table talking with the guys who, the men who, this is their profession, and the ways in which they had to kind of create language that kind of cut them off from the implications of what their talent and their minds and their skills were being used for. And that, here we've gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis and diving under desks, and and the horrors of the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that all of this whole venture out there that was putting us on the brink of global suicide was done in such a routine way. That was just, this was business, and people came to work, and then you'd walk down the hall and you'd think, well, is this the walls embedded with plutonium? And the reason I say I was the only woman is because I remember going there, and you'd put on those little booties to walk in and out of different rooms, and it had to fit us with respirators, and they couldn't get one that fit fit my face. And finally they did, but I remember just the...
So you got all suited up with the rest of the monitoring?
Yeah.
Can you remember any...
And we would go very early. The meetings would be like 7 in the morning. And by the time I got to the office, it would just, I'd be completely drained, and
Can you remember anything specifically about the buildings that you went in any particular buildings, or why they were taking you there?
Well, the meetings were held, at the plant so that they could, brief the monitoring committee that they weren't on site. They weren't off site. They were mostly on site. And what became obvious to me at this point is that this ultimate recommendation of closing and phasing out the plant was never going to come up for discussion. That what had been instituted was sort of a permanent commission to allow things to go forward, to placate the opposition, to allow to force the controversy under the table, so that then our work as the advocates became putting pressure on Lamm-Wirth to go beyond this committee, that it was like had no teeth. It had no political teeth. It couldn't get anything done. And just piling information as a substitute for actually implementing the real recommendations of the Lamm-Wirth Task Force.
Was it at this time that you started to think about doing some kind of demonstration, or had this been in the works before that?
Well, we'd been doing demonstrations all along at Rocky Flats.
Can you describe something about what they
Sometimes they were all to draw the public attention and further educate the population around Rocky Flats and throughout the metropolitan area about the presence of the plant, the history of the plant. And some of the demonstrations had been during congressional races, for example. People went door to door around homes near the plant and got teaspoons full of soil, put them in baggies, and then delivered a suitcase full of dirt in baggies with people's name and address on there, asking congressional candidates to, would they commit to have the soil tested. And
these were congressional candidates all around the state?
no,
or
just for the Rocky Flats thing. And one of the, I think, more interesting and dramatic demonstrations that we did was we did released helium-filled balloons at Rocky Flats with little tags on them, excuse me, that said, if you find this tag, this balloon, this was released from Rocky Flats. Rocky Flats makes the plutonium core for every nuclear weapon in the U.S. arsenal. There have been numerous fires, blah, 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 and that the radiation hazards exist, and if you found this balloon and this tag, would you please mail it back to us? Well, we got tags from as far, up as the Canadian border returned to us. So we were doing demonstrations there all the time and trying to keep, Rocky Flats in the public eye and let the politicians know that we weren't going away, that we were going to keep the issue, front and center by a variety of means. And it was when it became obvious that they were going to study this to death, or study it till we were all dead, that we needed to escalate the kind and number of demonstrations at Rocky Flats. And so the anti-nuclear movement, the anti-nuclear power movement, was gaining a lot of visibility nationally at the same time in terms of problems of exposure to radiation and nuclear waste and that sort of thing. So it was in that context that we proposed to hold a national demonstration at Rocky Flats. And I went to all these national meetings and lobbied that the two sites for nationally coordinated demonstrations, one should be nuclear weapons and one should be nuclear power, because all the waste, or the majority of the waste, was from nuclear weapons. The people who are already victims of the radiation were from nuclear weapons testing and production and their two-time use, and that you couldn't separate the two technologies really, both in terms of their effects and as well as the vehicle through which proliferation was going to take place internationally. So everybody agreed, and so there were demonstrations called for Rocky Flats and Barnwell.
Barnwell is a nuclear power
plant. I think it's in South Carolina. I don't remember actually. And so we set out to organize and make Rocky Flats a national issue to further bring pressure to bear on Colorado politicians to move on with this Lamm-Wirth task force. And we did other things too. For example, we really did try to keep up the dialogue with the union and on conversion. We organized for Jeff Dumas, who's one of the real thinkers in economic conversion from military to civilian production, to come and to be there on various occasions and to talk about how would you go forward with an economic conversion study of Rocky Flats. And we tried to push the governor to do that too. So once marginally effective effort that we put in motion was kind of the Buck Stops Here campaign, where we wanted the governor to get the economic conversion study going toward the implementation of that Lamm-Wirth task force recommendation that the plant should ultimately be closed and phased out. Well, we knew that to do that you also had to address the mission of the plant in a sort of a national security context, and that to push for the closure of the plant meant also that you had to started addressing the so-called justification for what the Rocky Flats actually produced, which are nuclear weapons. So some of us, began the conversation about, well, what would be the international equivalent of close and convert Rocky Flats, and that's where the proposal for a nuclear weapons freeze started to become the real conversation. We had to end the Cold War. We had to work in two parallel directions at the same time: a local hazard, and the global threat. So we started talking with people about what would be the proposal that we could put forth and try to organize people to get behind. And
so this was kind of happening simultaneously, the beginnings of the nuclear freeze.
Right, exactly right.
Thinking and movement.
Right.
And
the Rocky Flats demonstration not only took place, not only focused on, Rocky Flats as a focus, but we organized the efforts there to expose the whole network of nuclear weapons production facilities. That this wasn't an isolated problem in Denver, Colorado, or outside of Denver, Colorado, but that there was a nuclear weapons complex. And so while we had produced a really good, solid document on Rocky Flats, we then went to produce the same sort of thing that exposed the nuclear weapons complex, and with a map of where things were, who does what, the transportation routes and all that sort of thing. So during the Rocky Flats demonstration of 78, it culminated in people coming from all over the country, and coming and learning about what was going on in Texas and Hanford, Washington, and Savannah River, South Carolina. And then at the Rocky Flats demonstration, there was actually the Plutonium Path caravan, where people left from Savannah River and drove a truck with mock plutonium containers to the Rocky Flats demonstration to dramatize that it's in essence the whole country's being implicated in this production process, having people endangered driving down the highway next to these trucks. And so we were trying to break through the idea that nuclear weapons are somehow out there, not a part of our everyday reality, that the nuclear threat is real. It's a part of the fabric of your life, and we have a real investment in trying to bring it to an end. So at the national level, we're trying to pull together the idea of the nuclear freeze campaign, and also keep the real threat from the production, testing, and deployment of these weapons a real community-based issue. So that's the network, and then we organized these national hearings on radiation victims.
Going back just a minute, when you first came out with the booklet, Local Hazard, Global Threat.
Right.
Was that was before the 1978 demonstration?
Yes.
Several years before?
Yeah, several years before.
Who actually, were you a part of putting that together?
Yes, yeah. It was Maury Wolfson, Jock Cobb, Judy Danielson, and myself. And I'm sure there's other people, but we were the kind of core group, and we called ourselves the Rocky Flats Action Group. And there were people that Maury was working with, I think, that were pretty involved too, but
so that kind of in-depth look at Rocky Flats sort of set the stage for the broadening of the work to include the whole complex?
That's right. I mean, we did this thing about Rocky Flats. Then we went and tried to get this growing anti-nuclear movement to deal with nuclear weapons, and it just wasn't nuclear power. And then the agreement to do the two places, the weapons in the Rocky Flats and Barnwell. And that then at the Rocky Flats demonstration, we did this whole thing about the nuclear weapons complex with training about how do you find out, how do you produce. And then following that, we then produced this second booklet on, the nuclear weapons complex, and to continue that kind of organizing.
Yeah.
Then we organized the Nuclear Weapons Facility Task Force, and that was a project of both the American Friends Service Committee in the Denver office, which Judy and I were part of, and the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a guy named Mike Jendrzik. And we then brought on a regular basis everybody who was organizing around these nuclear weapons complex facilities to strategy meetings and coordinated action, sharing information. So we had people, as I said, from like Texas and the Lawrence Livermore Labs. Everybody was organizing at the local level, essentially doing the same kinds of work that we were doing in Colorado. And I won't say that, some of it had been going on simultaneous, to us. People were getting the same sorts of ideas, but we brought it all together so that this task force then became the early base for launching the nuclear weapons freeze campaign. So these were the local communities that understood the real, sort of the reality of nuclear weapons in all manifestations, and also had an investment in coming up with a national security proposal that we felt people could mobilize around. And then it quickly moved way beyond that network of locally based campaigns. But that was the yeast. That was the yeast that caused it.
Can you talk some specifically about the 1978 demonstration? Because that was really the first major demonstration, I believe, that attracted a lot of media
At that point,
attention.
it was the largest disarmament demonstration in the history of the country, I think. You historian will have to check that. But we had like 6,000 people, if I recall, and it was the largest, demonstration against nuclear weapons. And
just at a guess, would you say that there was a equal proportion of people coming from other places to the people locally, or do you have any idea?
I don't have any idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it was. My guess is that it was 2/3 from Colorado and 1/3 from around the country. But there were definitely people from all over the place, because the training that we did, the demonstration, and then we did the training the next day, and that training was a critical component in not making this just a one-day event, but the launching of a real coordinated movement.
And can you describe the training? What was its purpose?
The purpose was to talk about, how do you do the research, how do you do the organizing, what kinds of things we had done to raise public awareness. There's a workshop on, low-level radiation and the potential hazards, the biology of the whole thing. So it was kind of training from basic science to basic organizing. And so that demonstration got huge attention and really did, we set out to make Rocky Flats a national issue, and in fact it did become an issue. That also took the campaign in completely different directions than those of us who'd started it had intended. And
Can you talk about
yeah,
that?
this is, I guess this is what you learn happens when you launch something. Pretty soon you have no control over it, and you just learn to go with the directions. But we had, as I said, we were starting to explore the freeze concept, and locally we had been, educating, and we had what we thought was a pretty clear path toward pushing this even further in the direction that we wanted. And one of the things we did at the demonstration was a symbolic civil disobedience, which was meant to highlight the fact that we'd been asking for action and getting no action. And that in the face of no action, maybe it was time that we would have to keep escalating. So the symbolic eventually would become, a real occupation of the tracks to block the activity. And, the fact that so many people were coming from all over the country also raised the stakes for everybody who was coming from around the country, that this wasn't just a Colorado thing now. They were thinking, I think, in their minds, probably it was their thing too. So one of the people was Dan Ellsberg, and
he was invited. You reached out to him?
We invited him, and he wanted to. He agreed and he came. He was one of the speakers, and he wanted to do the symbolic civil disobedience. And what happened is that when they got out there on the tracks, instigated, I think, in large part by Dan's sense that things needed to go faster, it turned into that the people out there wanted to make it a permanent, occupation, and they were going to stay there, and Jimmy Carter was going to come and meet them, and they were going to, it was going to be their last stand. And
now that kind of upset the plans that you had carefully made with people at the plant site. Is that right?
Yes, we had made our intentions and our plans clear, and had sort of, my memory is that all along what we had, because we'd had this open relationship with the union and an open connection with them, disagreeing, we were trying to model ourselves in a very Gandhian kind of, campaign. You give your adversary a chance to do it differently and make clear what your plans will be. Mm-hmm. And the same had been true with the city officials and with Rockwell International.
Uh-huh.
I mean, we had...
So you had involved them?
We'd involved them in the sense that, we kept saying, making demands and saying, you need to do this. I mean, this is the direction that things have to go. And public opposition is growing, lawsuits are being filed, the handwriting's on the wall. And we're going to show you that, we didn't say it in so many words, but we'll demonstrate for you that the time has come for government and official action to close and convert this plant. And we'll demonstrate that the public is behind us. And our thinking is that we would do this, withdraw, spend some time negotiating, and then come back and escalate. So that was our plan. But the control of it was at that moment taken out of our hands by the people who wanted to stay there. And that's when the Rocky Flats Action Group and was split off from what formed there on the tracks, which was the Rocky Flats Truth Force. With
did you feel at the time, what was your feelings? Had you made any promises or anything of that sort to the management of Rocky Flats about this being a symbolic civil disobedience?
Well, we didn't make any promises. We made declarations.
Oh.
And it made me, I was very angry that Dan Ellsberg, coming from the outside, and without any sort of negotiation or consultation with the local organizers and some other people from the local community who hadn't had any historic involvement in this, decided that they could just sort of go off in their own direction. And, at the time it felt, it kind of gutted any power that we might have been building, and credibility, power stemming from credibility, and from saying I'm going to do this and then doing it and showing them that, look, we can do it. We got, you know, all the national news, we've got this and that. Any political capital that we'd built up was, in my view, completely squandered by an impetuous action. And in fact, a lot of bad press ensued from that permanent occupation on the tracks. You know, that we can't keep control, and there was a knife fight or something like that on the tracks. Some pretty bad press. Some very deeply concerned and committed individuals participated in that permanent occupation and became, you know, forceful, effective, ongoing organizers, you know, against the plant and for alternatives. So, you know, as things unfolded, you think we lost control. And I don't mean control in the sort of sick psychiatric sense. I mean control of a campaign that we'd been long building in a methodical, thoughtful kind of way, laying relationships out very clearly, having serious conversations with key stakeholders. And I think I felt a real responsibility that I couldn't deliver on, you know, the vision, much less on, you know, our promise to a lot of people that we had made, that we will do this in a responsible way. We're making the case. We have a very clear path here. We have clear demands. We have a recommendation that the plant should be closed and, you know, phased out. And so the whole image of the movement was completely, of the campaign against Rocky Flats, was taken in a stereotypical direction. And so it's at that moment that I felt that the case on Rocky Flats essentially had been made, and that you have to make lemonade out of lemons. And you just go on, you find a way. And pretty much, you know, within weeks, is my memory, we had found a way to say we have to work together and find another way. But it became clear to me personally that the moment to push the freeze proposal was in fact at our doorstep, and that we needed to I needed to pour myself into that. That we needed to keep the pressure on Rocky Flats going, and that maybe the flavor and the character of it it was going to be what it was going to be anyway. But that the Cold War side of the issues were even more possible now because of the growing international peace movements in Europe. And
now, that was going on simultaneously, right? Just around the same time as the 1978 demonstration?
Yeah, the 1978 demonstration put, you know, like I was being in contact in the organized, because I was traveling all over the country. And one of the places I spent a lot of time was in fact here in the Boston area, because we wanted the endorsement of some really key groups, like the Union of Concerned Scientists. So I was up here meeting with Henry Kendall, wanting, you know, their support.
Henry Kendall was associated with
the Union of Concerned Scientists. He was the founder of it and the major, you know, he's a professor at MIT. And I met with all of the people whose credibility, if we could get their endorsement and their support, might put us over the edge. So that's why the flavor of the campaign going into, you know, there's a bunch of teepees out on a railroad track from, I've got Bernard Feld and Victor Weisskopf and Phil Morrison and, you know, all these people who'd been a member, who'd been part of the Manhattan Project, saying, you know, we will endorse or we will support or we'll follow your work. I mean, we had some pretty big names that we were talking to, like Margaret Mead, didn't endorse us, but the day after the demonstration when we got all of the visibility, you know, we got a phone call from her office saying that I was out talking to everybody saying, we're really worried about our community, and because this is happening to a community and our health and safety are, you know, in danger, we have the makings for a grassroots movement that maybe could break through the numbing of nuclear weapons to push policy in the direction of getting, you know, some change in the mutual assured destruction direction in U.S.-Soviet relations. And so when I was traveling up here, it became obvious that we had to have something that people could be for. Okay, we were exposing the trap, but so what's the way out of the trap? Locally, the way out of the trap is an economic conversion plan that's serious, that takes the worker, you know, future retraining, whatever components of that needed to be. We were really committed to that. And it wasn't just sort of a temper tantrum we were having, a momentary, sort of like, stop, you know, bringing plutonium into it. It wasn't that. We were trying to do some complex problem solving here. And so the conversations were already starting at the national level in places like, you know, Boston. I had met Randy Forsberg, and the people who were part of this, you know, working group up here, the Boston Study Group. And so it was 79 and 80, right after the demonstration, that we really started holding meetings, getting prepared to launch the Freeze campaign. And some of us went on a delegation to the Soviet Union. I was on this.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Again, it was the national office of the American Friends Service Committee organized a delegation of people to go to Moscow to explore the idea that had been put forth by the Boston Study Group of the nuclear freeze, a mutual halt in the production, testing, and deployment. Just stop where you are, and then from there begin, you know, serious negotiations going downward. And so it was William Sloane Coffin, Arthur Macy Cox, Helen Caldecott, Marta Daniels, myself, Terry Province, and there were a couple, maybe one or two other people, I don't remember, but we were, and Arthur Macy Cox was a former CIA agent who had written a book on nuclear proliferation and U.S.-Soviet relations. Mm-hmm. And William Sloane Coffin, you know, was...
Can you just describe a little bit who he is?
Yeah, William Sloane Coffin had also actually been in the CIA and was the senior minister at the Riverside Baptist Church. Had been, you know, eloquent and visionary leader of the anti-war movement, kind of converting, you know, to that from his military background and intelligence background, and so that group. Oh, Everett Mendelsohn was also on that day, a Harvard professor, and so we went with the purpose of talking with high-level people in the Soviet society. And they were, at that point, you know, largely organized around these academies that were sort of think tanks, but had more than a think tank relationship to the government. They really more influenced policy than just studied it. And then Brezhnev was the head of the Soviet Union at that time, and because Arthur Macy Cox was on the trip, we were taken very, very seriously, because everybody knew his work and knew how much he knew, and so we had some pretty high-level contacts and meetings during that trip, and an indication.
This was about 1979.
About 1979. Had some pretty serious indications that they indeed would respond if there was broad public support for a freeze proposal, that made sense to them. And I mean, all you can do is say, okay, they said they would. Now, what's the harm in the United States putting it on the table? So that became our job, is to try to get the United States to put it on the table. It doesn't give the Soviets any advantage, but the potential of stopping it in its tracks would buy time and then serious negotiations. But this time, during this time, the Committee on the Present Danger was, organizing. There was a lot of opposition to the SALT II agreements being generated, and there was the moral majority and the political targeting of a number of politicians. This is the first time in which I think it was the Heritage Foundation and some of those right-wing conservative think tanks started talking about, it's been called so many things, but Star Wars, I mean the missile defense system.
So there was really counter pressure building against, to continue the
arms.
nuclear.
Oh yeah,
arms.
there was a lot of organizing by the missile gap sort of psychology was rampant at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so Senator Frank Church was targeted, and George McGovern, and some other progressive Democratic politicians. And I think I have my dates roughly right about this, but it was at that time that the right wing was targeting Frank Church and George McGovern. And Frank Church was feeling very vulnerable, apparently, and so was McGovern, but particularly Frank Church. And he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he's soft on communism and placating the Soviets. And so Frank Church kind of fabricated a news story that he was going to break, that there were all these Russian troops in Cuba. Well, in fact, this was not news, and it ended up playing into the right wing's argument. The Soviets were very upset that he was caving to campaign pressures. Wanted to show his constituents that he was strong on communism, and it ended up helping to set the stage for the collapse of the SALT II agreement.
Uh-huh.
Hello. Hi, sweetie.